Hi, everybody. I wanted to take an opportunity to welcome you to tonight's event, How Millennials Are Changing Politics in Latin America. This event is a partnership between America's Quarterly, who just put out this new issue on millennials in Latin American politics, and YPA, or the Young Professionals of America. My name is Chase Harrison. I'm on the internal committee for YPA. YPA, for those of you who don't know, we're a network of young professionals who have an interest in Latin America. We have 3 chapters in New York, in Miami, and in DC, and we put on a variety of events about Latin America, from events such as this to mezcal tastings to gastro diplomacy feasts. So if you're interested in YPA, you can go to our website, you can go to as-coa.org and look up Young Professionals of the America, or you can come find me after the event to learn more about membership and the organization. And I'll just conclude my bit by thanking our sponsors, Diageo and BMW, for helping make this event possible. And now I'll hand it over to Luisa Franco, who's going to moderate the event.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Luisa. I am an editor and a producer of the America's Quarterly podcast. This is the launch of our latest issue, which is entirely dedicated to the question, how are millennials changing politics in Latin America? I'm a millennial myself, and our panelists are my fellow millennials. We currently represent about 23% of Latin America's population, and we already have 2 presidents who are themselves millennials, Gabriel Boric in Chile and Nayib Bukele in El Salvador. They, of course, represent 2 very different political projects, and we are here to discuss what the ascendancy of this generation means for the region. We have here the editor-in-chief of America's Quarterly, Brian Winter, and in the Zoom
Not a millennial.
Not a millennial by
4 years.
By 4 years.
By 4 years.
By 4 years. And my fellow millennials, Peruvian journalist Andrea Moncada. Hi, Andrea.
Hello, hi. Great to be here.
Andrea wrote the cover story for the issue. It's a great story. She came to really interesting conclusions about this generation in politics. And we have Samuel, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Hello, Samuel Perez Alvarez. He is a congressman from Guatemala and a member of Movimiento Semilla Party. He's going to tell us all about the founding of this movement and what it's like to be a millennial in politics in Latin America today. Welcome and thank you for being here. I'm going to start with you, Brian, since you came up with the idea for having this issue. I would like to ask you, what was on your mind when you thought of this question? And why do you think it's important to talk about millennials in politics at this moment in time?
Well, thank you for the question. Thank you all for being here tonight in person. All right, good for us. Look, I think that we were motivated largely by some of the people who ended up on the cover of this issue. And you mentioned the fact that there are already 2 millennial presidents. And I certainly believe that they could not be more different in terms of their style. You have Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, who is 41. He also just barely makes the cutoff to be considered a millennial. And he has come in with a strategy that really concentration of power. He's used the military on at least one occasion to intimidate Congress. He's extremely effective on social media. And under this state of emergency that has been in place since earlier this year, more than 50,000 alleged criminals have been put in prison as part of this security sweep that he's undertaking, according to many NGOs, without any due process in a lot of those cases. And then kind of on the other side, you have Gabriel Boric, who took office, I think, in March, and represents just a completely different, I think, much more democratic vision. He talks often and convincingly about climate change. He talks, he has a cabinet that is majority women. And he also speaks movingly, in my view, about democracy, human rights, and the need to respect people in Chile and elsewhere who think differently. even in the wake of this constitutional referendum that his side lost earlier this year, he came out and immediately said, we have to listen to the message that the majority of Chileans just sent us. And so, part of what we wanted to do with this issue and the, incredibly difficult challenge that we put to Andrea was which of these visions is more likely to prevail. I'm sure that you have all detected in the way that I've just described these two visions, which version that I would prefer that we see prevail. But you would have to be blind to not recognize the fact that Bukele currently has an approval rating above 85% and Boric is somewhere in the 20s. So I think there's lots here to unpack. That's what we want to do here tonight. The other thing that we wanted to do is, I think it's become so sort of rote to write about and talk about millennials in particular. And like, if you're from an older generation in this sort of like, very generalizing way. And we wanted to do something that was honest and real and mature. And I thought that, it's a credit to much of the staff of the publication is here tonight. I think it was a team effort to put it together. And I am immensely grateful to Congressman Perez for being here, and also to Andrea, who just did such an exceptional job with the cover story, and who I know will talk about many of the conclusions that she came to after talking to 12 millennial politicians of all kinds of ideological flavors across the region in her presentation tonight. So again, thank you all for being here, and I look forward to hearing what the panel will say.
Andrea, let's start with you. As Brian said, we asked you to answer this really challenging question. It's really hard to summarize the zeitgeist of a generation, especially when we're talking about a whole region, and a region as diverse as Latin America, of course, politically diverse, socially diverse. Could you tell us what some of the conclusions that you came to were regarding what this generation wants from politics and what factors shaped this current generation of politicians in the region?
Hi, I'm so sorry. I think my internet shut down for a brief second, so I don't know if the question was directed to me. I think it might be. Could you do that again? I'm so sorry. It literally just shut down and then came back up again.
We should have flown you here.
That would have been amazing. I would have not said no.
All right.
Yeah, so we asked you, of course, we understand that it's really hard to summarize the zeitgeist of a whole generation, especially if we're talking a generation across the whole region. But you came to some really interesting conclusions regarding what this generation wants from politics and what some of the factors were that shaped this generation's thinking and motivation. So could you tell us what you think defines this generation in politics today? From your reporting.
Yes, that is a challenging question to answer. But I think based on all the conversations that I had with the 12 different politicians that I spoke to, the overarching theme that I found was this feeling of frustration and desire for change that was really prevalent among all of them. And this frustration was basically stemmed from a fairly simple idea, I think, or a simple, well, not simple, but perhaps straightforward might be the better word, point of view, which was we were promised as a generation, right? We were promised certain things. We were promised more economic prosperity. We were promised a better life than our parents. We were promised more political participation. We were promised a better functioning democracy in our countries. And overall, there has been a lot of progress, but at the same time, there are very structural problems that we face in Latin America are still very much there. And they are hindering my generation and people younger than me, their ability to achieve a good life. So I think that's the overarching feeling I think that I found.
Congressman Perez, how does that sound to you as someone who is a millennial in politics in Guatemala. What motivated you to enter politics? I know that you started your public life in the student movement. So if you could talk a little bit about that and tell us what made you enter politics to begin with and what factors shaped your political thinking.
Yeah, well, first, thank you so much for the invitation. Yes, it was really a complicated political context here in Guatemala, same as in Latin America, I think. There was a political crisis here in my country because there was like massive robbery of public money, of tax money. I remember that there was an assignation of money for food for patients in public hospitals, but there was no food for them because money disappeared and they were stealing it. So people in public markets gave up their sales of the day in order to give food for sick people. And that was just one thing, And that incentive, like a massive anti-corruption mobilizations here in Guatemala. And in that context, a group of people, mostly from academic backgrounds, I was the president of Students Association in my university. We decided to start a political party. And with all odds against us, we succeeded. So I think the article like identified this variable, like there's some mobilizations that incentive these constructions of new political parties, but we have like these high entry barriers for the construction of new political parties here in Guatemala, and I think all the Latin American region, but that is like the complex political context.
Could you describe some of these barriers that you faced to founding Movimiento Semilla and talk about some of the structural difficulties that you think millennials face when trying to enter politics in the region today?
Sorry, I lost you 1 second. Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
Sure. You mentioned that you faced a number of barriers to founding Movimiento Semilla. Could you talk about some of those, describe what they were and what it was like? And also, what are the structural barriers that millennials face today in trying to enter politics?
Yes, well, I think that there's like this conviction in general that we need more democracy, but I think that there is a rejection of there isn't actually a rejection of democracy as a political regime, but what we have in our countries isn't really democracies. We have like plutocracies, we have oligarchies, and a lot of corruption that distorts the democratic system. For example, last elections in Guatemala, the corruption regime blocked our presidential candidate. She was the general attorney who opened corruption cases against the president at the moment and his financiers. And there's a lot of like illicit electoral financing. So we always compete in disadvantage, always. There are really high entry barriers to the political system. For example, to register a political party, we need, they say that the constitution says 25,000 affiliation signatures, but in reality, we have to collect like 110 more or less, because of these high entry barriers, because we do not have money, for example, or there are like bureaucratic barriers and political enemies that do not want us to become a party or something like that. And finally, I think that the result is that people making decisions now in the government are thinking about them and their financiers and not about the people outside the government. For example, since 2015, in Guatemala, the legitimacy of or social support of every president actually declines faster and deeper with every new president. We now have the most rejected president of all times at the beginning of the democratic era, for example. And that is really dangerous, but we're not talking about democracy here. We're this distortion of a political system that isn't working actually.
Andrea, in your piece, you came to the conclusion that millennials today want reform, not revolution, right? What is it that you heard from the politicians that you speak to, including Congressman Paris, regarding what they want from politics? And why do you think there is this tendency to want incremental change rather than radical change?
Yes, so I have to really largely agree with what Samuel just said about democracies in Latin America being very limited, even though they exist, right? And I think that's it, right? Like there isn't this rejection of democracy, which is one of the questions that we kind of try to answer in the article. There isn't this rejection of democracy as a regime. There is a desire to participate in the system, and so all these politicians that I spoke to, that desire is what drove them to get involved, right? Even though they perhaps originally were not particularly interested in politics to begin with, right? Like some of them told me that they actually had a really bad idea, really bad low opinion of their politicians that already existed, the type of politics that already existed in their home countries. And so I think the desire for reform rather than revolution kind of is tied to this, right? It's tied to this idea or this belief that, okay, like democracy, we do believe in it. It does exist. Like it is there for us. And it is the best system that humanity has invented so far. And it has brought some certain progress to the region, right? Like there are more political rights for more groups of society. You do see more social mobility, social mobilization in order to achieve these rights. But there are still groups of society, people very highly in high positions of power, economic elites, political elites that have existed for decades and decades and decades in the region that still do not really have the incentive nor have a real motive to allow these reforms to take place.
I wanted to make a couple comments. I think it's interesting to ask like how much of what we're talking about so far is universal and how like other generations, if they were seated at the table, would kind of be nodding their head and be like, yeah, we dealt with that too. And how much is actually unique and sort of characterizes this generation that we're here talking about today, which by the way, did we define at the beginning of the years of the millennial generation? It's if anybody's curious, it's anybody born between 81 and 96.
Yes,
right.
People who are between 26 and 41 years old, that's a millennial generation.
There you go. So I'm 44. That's why I missed out. But look, I think of two things that do seem to make this generation different that Andrea and Samuel have both alluded to, I think, in different ways. The first one is this idea, the fact that particularly people in South America who grew up during the 2000s, that was a time of economic plenty. That was then followed by a time of vacas flacas, as they say in Argentina. And I think that's had a big influence on the way people think about their lives and about politics. And there's reflections of that here in the United States, certainly as well, where the experience, it was not so much that there was a commodities boom here in the 2000s, but I think the early 2010s were a tough decade. And so that period of high hopes that are then followed by kind of years of stagnant economies. And I think of countries like Brazil, where your average Brazilian is 10% poorer than he or she was 10 years ago. And that certainly testifies to the anger that you feel in a lot of places. And then the other thing, and it has to do with the redemocratization that we saw in the 70s and 80s, which was a great thing and very dramatic in a short period of time. I feel like maybe people don't celebrate this enough anymore because now we're in an age of, where democracies are under pressure and in some cases in retreat. But the year I was born, in 1977, there were only 3 true democracies in Latin America, Costa Rica, Colombia, and ironically, Venezuela. And then by the time we got to 1994, there was only one true dictatorship, which was Cuba. And since then, of course, we've seen 2 more, and then some that are kind of in more of a hybrid state. But what's interesting is that in a lot of countries that experienced that redemocratization in the 80s, which was a very positive thing, the generation that came in and entered politics is still there. Like 35 or 40 years later, it's still the same faces. One of whom, by the way, was just reelected in Brazil on Sunday for whatever other benefits he may have. I mean, Lula has been center stage in Brazilian politics since the 1980s, the early 1980s. One thing that I thought, Andrea, that you wrote about in great detail and very convincingly in your piece was the barriers that the status quo politicians in general have put up towards new entrants. And maybe you could talk about that, because that for me was something that I learned from your article, was just how universal this tale of the existing system, and in some cases it really is generational, putting up these really difficult barriers that make entry very hard.
Yeah, I think, well, as with everything, I feel, or with most things in Latin America, like these issues are very structural, and they have existed for, it's like the way the system is set up in the political and economic system, the way it is set up in the region is very much closed off and rigid, and makes it very difficult for true change to occur, right? And so I think one of when I say that there is very little incentive for the kinds of reform that a lot of people in my generation want. So, for example, better public education, right? Or better employment, more access to employment, to reduce inequality, etc., to have less crime, less corruption. These are all things that are, they don't really, they're very common sense in a way, right? Which is actually one of the quotes that one of the people I spoke to told me, like that Ana Chamorro from Chile, she characterized this as common sense. But they don't change, because they're like the way, for example, the economy is set up, right? You alluded to right now to this great period of growth in Latin America with the commodities boom in the 2000s and 2010s, which should have brought about, in theory, a pretty significant reduction in, or better public services, and all these things that I just mentioned. But the labor market, the way the economies of Latin America function, they're very much based on resource extraction, right? They are based on mining, they're based on oil, they're based on gas and agriculture. And with the first four, they're not very labor intensive industries. And so again, this feeds the cycle of elites not really having to invest that much in their populations through education, right? So it's these things, these barriers that I think make it so hard for a generation of politicians that have been in power for decades to really let new people come in, or to let new ideas come in, or to implement the change that, people from my generation or younger want.
And we're talking here about a generation that had a number of promises that weren't fulfilled, right? And the region still faces considerable challenges, right? Inequality is still very high. Climate change is already causing a lot of destruction in many places in the region. I wanted to ask you both if you think that this generation lacks a sense of urgency regarding the size of the challenges that we face. Do you think that's the case? Congressman Perez and Andrea, whoever wants to take that on first.
I would like to comment on that, because when I was reading the article, I was thinking that Guatemala maybe is a particular case, because in general, there has been economic prosperity, but not in Guatemala. We were one of the few countries in the world that weren't able to reduce poverty within the period of the Millennium Development Goals. Guatemala is now the most unequal country in Latin America, for example, the less competitive and one of the poorest of the world. And I think there's a correlation between the political system and the economic system, because we were born in democracies, my generation and younger people. But I think that democracy hasn't been able to deliver like economic results to solve people's daily life. I think there is a more profound critique in the economic system. I believe that the neoliberal or neoclassical system of free markets not only doesn't work for people, for social majorities maybe, but it has root faults. For example, inequality. That's a good example, because for free market extremists, inequality is like an incentive, not a problem. And the main fault, I believe, the main fault of the model is the assumption behind it. Because, for example, perfect competition, rational agents, no externalities, complete information, none of that is real. So unexpected consequences are really bad for people. But the other thing is that it doesn't solve the daily life problems of people, meaning better salaries, working conditions, access to quality public services for all, prosperity and growth opportunities, etc. So people don't have to worry about basic needs. Actually, when I was reading the article, I was thinking maybe Guatemala, I think that we live in the free market utopia, because we have the lowest state sides measured by tax burden, is around 11%. One of the lowest tax rates in the world, between 5% and 7% of income tax. There is not a single antitrust policy or antitrust law. There are no public enterprises. Inflation is low and stable, and so on. But on the other hand, we have one of every 2 children in Guatemala live with chronic malnutrition. 60% of people live in poverty conditions. We're the most unequal country in Latin America, and so on. So I believe that there's, and that doesn't mean that we're seeking for another economic model, but we have to have a state and the political system that also delivers results for the economic problem of the daily life of people, especially social minorities.
For those of you who are in person and would like to ask questions, please just write them down in that notebook and send them to me, and I'll read them to them because they won't be able to hear you. So feel free to start doing that now. Andrea, Congressman Perez just mentioned the fact that democracy is having a hard time delivering on many of the needs that people have. And as we were saying previously, we now have these 2 millennial presidents who represent very different projects. And one of them is Nayib Bukele, very authoritarian. Which model, Boric or Bukele, do you think we're more likely to see in the coming years? And what factors do you think would define the region going one way or the other?
Yes, we've spoken about this before, and I think, as with everything, it depends. And so my intuition is that this anger or disillusionment that a lot of people feel, young people and also older people feel, with the way democracy has functioned in Latin America, that's probably going to steer us a bit more towards a Bukele style of governing than towards a Boric style of governing. And the reason I say this is because Chile in the region, I find to be very much an anomaly. So the very existence of Gabriel Boric as president of Chile right now is response to this uniqueness, this ability of the Chilean democratic system to absorb new players and incorporate them into the political establishment, right? That is very difficult and rare, I find, in the rest of Latin America. And I think Bukele is the perfect example of what happens when you have decades of violence, inequality, corruption, terrible public services, etc., a low economic growth, and a a country completely disillusioned with their political system. So here comes this guy, very young guy, presents himself as very modern, is in touch with the people, who will, deliver the changes and the demands of the Salvadorian population. That, I think, is probably is the factors that I just described that led to Bukele. They are more prevalent in, for example, where I'm from, Peru, and in many other, in Argentina right now, Javier Milei, he's pretty, he's doing fairly well in the polls, and in other places. And so I think, yeah, if you would ask me which way are we going to go, as things stand right now, I think the more likely outcome is a Bukele, more Bukeles than more Boriches.
Congressman Paris, please, would you like to comment on it?
Yeah, I would like to comment on that because it's really for me, it's really interesting this because I have Bukele as a neighbor, but I think the popularity of Bukele is not because of the political regime like this, his authoritarian ways, but for example, people in all the world, especially in Latin America, hates congresses. Social majorities don't really care if he brings military to the assembly in order to force a decision that will help improve their day-to-day life. The success of Bukele, I believe, remains in its effectiveness. He delivers fast and he communicates it successfully. I think Boric, on the other side, will deliver. He has the right ideas, the right cabinet team, but consensus takes time. And in a region where people die because of the absence of state or public policies, this period of time can make the difference in terms of social support, because it makes the difference between living in misery or starting a path of prosperity, or at least the illusion of that. I think the challenge actually is to make democratic ways to get results faster.
I want to open up for questions, but I wanted to ask you a last question regarding communication between generations. What do you two think this generation can learn from the previous one? And that's Brian's generation.
Oh, boy. Poster child.
and earlier than that. And next generations too, Gen Z. What can Gen Z teach millennials about politics? Whoever wants to take that on first.
Okay, I think Gen Z is very good at making themselves heard on the street, on social media. I think because they are the generation that pretty much does not recall a time where the internet did not exist. They are very good at communicating. They're very good at crafting messages. And I think that's one thing that, we could learn from them. As for the older generation, I think this goes a little bit back to your question on whether or not there is a lack of urgency among millennials. I think there is and there isn't. And one of the things we could learn from older generations is that consensus building takes time, that the changes that we want are going to take time as well. And that it's important to be able to work with people from across the aisle, which I think perhaps because of the way that politics is becoming more and more polarized, my generation is perhaps losing that ability a little bit. So that that sense of urgency that we have, we can adopt, or that we can encourage it by learning from the younger generations, the younger people, but we can also temper that with the knowledge that older people have about the need to build consensus.
Congressman Paris, what do you think you and your fellow millennials can or have learned from older generations? And as you observe younger people, what lessons do you take from them?
Well, I believe that from the older generation, the importance of raising our voices, especially in a context here in Guatemala, that our democracy is really young. So the importance of getting involved in public decisions, that is like a path right there. And from the other generation, Gen Z, I believe that for me, for example, the importance of seeing or looking more than into the economic problem, but another variables like social and environmental justice, racial and gender equality. And I think that's the future. We're going to have like public debates without those variables involved.
We have some questions here from our in-person audience, and if you're on Zoom, please submit them via the Q&A function. The first question is, what can be done by millennials and subsequent generations to remove the structural barriers, decrease corruption, and strengthen government institutions? These barriers that the two of you mentioned. Who wants to answer that? What can be done about it? Congressman Paris, do you want to start?
Okay. Well, I think that for my country it's really important to get involved because people do not get involved often in politics because of the fear of the war that was like 20, 30 years ago, and we haven't like a move forward from that moment in our history. But I believe that the world has initiated a transition and there is no turning back. There will be no politician that ignores climate change, for example, racial exclusion, gender inequality. And in Guatemala, for example, some of them are from a conservative perspective, but there will be from now on public debates about that. And people with real solution to that problem will eventually take power, and that I believe is my generation.
Andrea, do you want to comment on that?
Sure. I think the only way, in my view, of dismantling these barriers is continuing to encourage political participation. One of the congresswomen I spoke to for my piece, Tabat Amaral, she said something that I thought was very accurate. She said that people feel like politicians right now do not represent them. And that is one of the biggest problems with our democracies. And probably one of the main reasons why we could potentially keep going down the path of more authoritarian populism, right? And so the only way to counteract that lack of political representation is by encouraging more and more people from diverse sectors, not your typical politician that we've grown up seeing, but people from all walks of life, people from different sorts of sectors to participate, to engage. Because if we want to reform the system, we have to work within it, right? So I think that's the main way.
We have here with us Nick Burns, who edited the great piece that Andrea wrote, and he has a question. I think you might be able to hear him.
Yeah, he's the only reason we're letting him ask, because he's actually close to the microphone.
Let me know if you can hear me, Andrea and Congressman Perez.
Yes.
I wanted to ask about what you might call generational warfare. That is to say, so putting it rather strongly, but when I was writing a piece recently on Chile, I was learning about a difference of views even within President Boric's cabinet, where you have some mostly younger cabinet members who may have been associated with him. He was associated in the student movement, and some sort of older, often closer to the center, less left-wing politicians who are more associated with this generation that came up during the transition to democracy in Chile. So you've really got, that's one example of a kind of a difference of views between generations that that really has sort of high stakes for Chilean politics, because it'll decide how they sort of move forward in this on their new constitution and a bunch of other things. But in Brazil, on the other hand, you see members of different generations. There's a very young congressman elected who's a supporter of Bolsonaro.
Nicolas Ferreira.
Who am I right in thinking he had the most votes?
He had more votes than any other candidate for Brazil's House of Deputies, which is like their lower house, basically.
And Bolsonaro obviously is, I guess, is he a baby boomer or is he a Gen X?
He's a boomer.
He's a boomer.
I think,
Yeah.
right?
So,
Such a boomer, right?
so long story short, I'm curious what both of you think, Congressman Perez, perhaps in Guatemala, and Andrea, sort of more generally. What do you see as the more likely future for the region? Are generations going to be clashing with each other with different solutions to the problems that face the region? Or will we see collaboration between generations, maybe with certain political tendencies or notions?
Should I go first or should Samuel go first? Whichever. Should I go first? Okay. Yeah, that's that's an interesting question. I often wonder that myself, which will prevail, the more I don't know, I guess maybe we're hinting at more of a radical urgent sort of generation, and then more of a tempered vision. I really think it will depend on just how much the existing political polarization will deepen in the Latin American countries. I think if political polarization keeps on deepening, then the possibility for consensus among generations is going to be harder and harder. And if we somehow manage to get past that polarization right now, then it will be easier to work together. But it's hard for me to answer that, because it really depends on the next 10 years, I think, of what exactly happens if we actually do manage to get reformed through decrease inequality and all these problems that we've discussed tonight.
Yeah, from my perspective, it's a little bit different, I believe, because in Guatemala we lost a complete generation because of the war. This complete generation, maybe boomers, I believe, was either exiled or were killed. So we're starting to learn to live in democracy right now. So we don't have like social organizations or political parties, historical political parties, as, for example, El Salvador or Honduras or Mexico or our neighbors, Actually, the main difference that I see is mostly maybe not in the way of thinking, but in the way of acting, the political action. I see that more than any other variable. For example, in Congress, it's kind of funny because other congressmen and women sometimes makes fun of me or even allege me because I'm always on Twitter or something, or sometimes on Instagram Live, now TikTok. But some other times they get really angry because I found out, for example, that they're going to pass a really harmful bill against Guatemalan people or something related to corruption or impunity. And I announce it on social media and it becomes viral. And they don't know what to do because they do not understand what's happening. And I think we have contributed to stop a couple of harmful bills that would have passed otherwise. But I don't see it in terms of, I see it more like in terms of political action and ways of communicating than any other thing.
We have here one last question from the audience, and it is regarding this matter of communication. I'm not sure who it's from, but I'll just read it out. Though people are upset with structural inequality, they seem to put more faith in right-wing strongmen like Bukele instead of a social democrat like Boric. Is this a communication problem where people like Boric have a hard time expressing themselves to voters? Do you think that's the case, Congressman Paris and Andrea? And that's unfortunately going to have to be our last question because we're out of time.
Yeah, yes.
Go ahead, Samuel. It's okay.
Yes, as I was saying, I think that it's not about the left or right political identity. It's like the capacity to deliver results. So that's what I was saying, was that the challenge is to make democratic ways to get results faster. And that way, it isn't a discussion between should we have a right-wing conservative or a left-wing progressive, because none of them are like giving results to the daily life problems of people in Guatemala, for example. So I believe there's, of course, the way of communicating things, but to make those communications transformed in actions fast.
Yeah, I completely agree with Samuel. It's not a problem of messaging, in my opinion. It's because, well, when you bypass the democratic process, you probably are going to be faster and more efficient in many cases than when you're trying to build consensus and incorporate the voices of all sectors of society. And, you know, those sectors might not agree with each other. So to come to an agreement democratically is always going to be harder than to impose decisions.
Let's hope that's not the case. But thank you so much for being here in person. And for our guests, thank you so much for joining us. It's been great to talk to you all. And thank you, Brian.
Thank you all for being here, and good night.
Thank you. It's great
Thank
being
you.
here.